when Fourier and other trials were published, some of the editorials said, LDL, job done, let's move on. What I would like to do is to kind of paint a picture for you using my clinical chemistry background as to what moving on might look like, particularly in terms of lipid parameters, and I've quoted there non-HDL, apoB, triglyceride. What I'm going to do is underpin that discussion with some more detailed metabolic pictures that you can look at. But the other thing I want to do is to actually give you a strong health warning about the measurements of LDL cholesterol that come back to you from the clinical chemistry laboratory. What might that actually be, and should it come with a health warning regarding the numbers that you see, whether it be 0, 20, 50, or whatever. So let's look at assessing the full range of atherogenic potential, since we understand that apoB-containing lipoproteins are actually where it's at. If we go to this little ball diagram here, HDL has moved out of our view for the moment. It may come back, but at the moment it's moved out of our view as a target for therapy. And the target for therapy, really a target for therapies, are all of the apoB-containing lipoproteins. Starting at the top, we have chylomicrons and their remnants, and I'll discuss a little bit about that. And then a whole cascade of particles starting from VLDL all the way through to LDL and then small dense LDL. Which of these are the most atherogenic, and what do we capture when we measure LDL cholesterol? What do we capture when we measure non-HDL cholesterol, and how should we interpret that when you see that number on your report from the clinical chemistry laboratory? And of course, Lp(a) is there as a little soldier by itself because this atherogenic particle, as we understand it from the genetic studies, has a separate origin and a separate fate. And we're beginning to unpick that with some intense metabolic studies, but these are very demanding, and I don't think we have the full picture yet. So here we are. I love this stuff. Most of my cardiology colleagues, when I present it, glaze over. But it's good to understand a little bit of the background. On the right-hand side of the slide, there are the products of intestinal production. Chylomicrons, they appear in a wave, and then they disappear over about 2 to 3 hours. Usually, after your meal last night, you'll have had that. But you may have this morning the remnants of that meal as cholesterol-rich apoB48 containing particles that are removed effectively by receptors, unless you've got a problem with receptor removal or remnant removal. If you're hypertriglyceridemic, those remnants are still circulating this morning, and they are potentially atherogenic. Throughout the day, whether you're eating or not eating, the liver is pumping out VLDL, triglyceride, because you need it for energy. You need the triglyceride. It produces remnants, but also produces, through a lipolytic cascade, intermediate, low-density lipoprotein, not LDL, and those are cleared by remnants as well. So when you measure LDL cholesterol, you really are measuring intermediate density lipoprotein, LDL, and Lp(a). They come as that number. When you measure non-HDL cholesterol, you're including VLDL remnants and likely chylomicron remnants. So they are a picture of a broader range of atherogenic lipoproteins. And I've ranked those lipoproteins in the middle as LDL is causal because it's been all the way through the Hill criteria and it's made it through to intervention that lowers LDL, lowers disease. Lp(a) is pretty much probably causal, but we don't have a specific trial that lowers only Lp(a) that lowers disease as yet. That will come with some of the new agents that we have. I think I've put suspect causal VLDL remnants, IDL, and chylomicron remnants because we've got a strong case against them. Unknown, and I'll explain this a little bit, are the largest VLDL that are triglyceride-rich, that are newly produced from the liver, not remnants, and chylomicrons that are newly produced, full of triglyceride, but not yet full of cholesterol. They have to get that during the circulation. The evidence from epidemiology is that non-HDL cholesterol is strong, graded, consistent. HDL cholesterol I'm not worried about too much. Triglyceride is a strong univariate associate with risk, but if you include non-HDL cholesterol in the calculation, then as you see from the bottom of that chart there, the risk association actually disappears. So it's, again, evidence from epidemiology that it's these cholesterol-rich remnants that are included in non-HDL cholesterol that may be carrying the risk that is not present on LDL. It's additional to LDL. And again, the genetic studies bear this out. There's, on the left-hand side, a picture of VLDL being assembled in the liver. And I want to introduce another player, apoC3, because you'll be hearing a lot about that over the next 5 years. apoC3 aids lipoprotein assembly, and particularly the secretion of VLDL from hepatocytes, that we have that information. It also helps control VLDL and chylomicron removal. And if you have a lot of apoC3, removal is slow and those remnants persist. So it's a potential target. Lipolysis is important to clear these lipoproteins from the bloodstream, and ANGPTL3 is a modifier of the lipolysis rate, and it too has been pinpointed from genetic studies as a possible target, as is apoA5, which has a lot to do with chylomicron metabolism. So when you look at the genetics of these targets, and you say these alter triglyceride, but they don't alter LDL cholesterol per se, and then you put them in these genetic association studies, Mendelian randomization studies, you can see that, as with LDL cholesterol, when you adjust for triglyceride and HDL, it's an independent risk factor associated with a higher risk of disease here. And that's also true of triglyceride, in particular the triglyceride that's associated with these remnants. If you add LDL and HDL into the equation, you haven't modified that risk very much. But think about HDL that we all loved for about 10 or 20 years. If you add in LDL and triglyceride genetically determined into the equation, the association of HDL with risk disappears completely. So HDL is really not making it in terms of understanding lipid levels. What about the quantification of remnant cholesterol versus risk compared to LDL cholesterol versus risk? And this is data from the Copenhagen City Heart Study that's very illuminating. They looked at many hundreds of thousands of people, quantified remnant VLDL cholesterol versus LDL cholesterol, and all I would say is if you look at the X and Y axis, they're the same. If you have 2, 3, 4, 5 millimoles of LDL cholesterol, you get a risk association. If you have 2, 3, 4, 5 millimoles of remnant cholesterol, you have the same risk association. So the risk association per unit cholesterol, whether it's carried in a remnant particle or carried in an LDL particle, is the same. They're probably equally atherogenic in terms of their potential to cause coronary disease. Oh, I went backwards. There we are. So here is the health warning from a clinical chemist as to what you measure when you measure LDL cholesterol. You're actually measuring the cholesterol component, not the number of particles that are present. And we understand, as I'll explain a little bit from some studies, that what might matter is the number of LDL particles, not necessarily their cholesterol content. Non-HDL cholesterol, arguably a better risk marker of the total atherogenic potential of apoB containing particles in your bloodstream, as is apoB. And we have advocated just in the last few months that we should be moving to the measurement of apoB rather than LDL cholesterol as a primary target. If you can't afford that, measure non-HDL cholesterol. And the NICE guidelines have non-HDL cholesterol in the UK as the primary target for understanding what's going on. Most of you will get an LDL cholesterol that has been calculated by the Friedewald formula. When you get an LDL cholesterol below 70, I'm afraid to say the Friedewald formula is uniformly wrong. So the number of 0 is an overestimate. what you need to do is there are new formula that are present in the literature that you can go online and test, and it tells you what factors you should use to get the correct LDL or a better measure of LDL cholesterol than the Friedwald formula, because it depends on a fixed ratio of triglyceride to VLDL cholesterol, and actually that ratio alters when you're on statin therapy and when you're on PCSK9 therapy and when the LDL is low. And it overestimates the decrease in LDL, and therefore that number of 5 or 10 might really be a number of 15 or 20. And apoB gives you a better guide there. So there's the health warning about LDL cholesterol and the benefits of measuring some of these other factors. What about the actions of drugs on non-HDL cholesterol or the total atherogenic profile that you see in the bloodstream? Well, this is from a long while ago, but we now understand, or we understood then, that if you have a low triglyceride level and give somebody a statin, most of what you lower is LDL cholesterol. LDL cholesterol can go down 45%. Triglyceride hardly budges at all if you have a triglyceride less than 1.5 millimoles per liter. But if your triglyceride is greater than 2, you're hypertriglyceridemic, and you see a lot of these patients, a statin will lower point for point triglyceride as much as it lowers LDL cholesterol. That means all of those particles, be it large VLDL, small VLDL, IDL, and LDL, are all reduced in a uniform sense. So that is a benefit that you can see from statin therapy on the total atherogenic profile. Why is that important? Well, here's an analysis from Jupiter. And this is from that group where the LDL was 57 milligrams per deciliter, so that's close to whatever a new target would be. And they looked at the risk ratio of having a minimal or greater change in VLDL cholesterol, a minimal or greater change in small VLDL particles versus triglyceride or larger VLDL particles. And you can see here the benefits of having a larger change on the statin in VLDL cholesterol or in small VLDL particles, remnants, gives you an extra benefit on top of the change of LDL down to a target of 57. So if you're at target, then we have to start looking at these other lipoprotein fractions to begin to understand how we might better decrease risk. I'm going to skip that. PCSK9 increases LDL receptor activity, but it also increases the activity of the VLDL receptor, CD36, which is a fatty acid receptor, apoER2, which is a receptor for apoE, CD18, and other things, because they share the same structural conformation. So PCSK9 may have multiple effects in the same way that statins may have multiple effects on lipoprotein metabolism, and in particular on the receptors that are present. Just to touch on this, the receptors, there's the metabolic channel that I showed you earlier. If you give a statin or PCSK9, you get very similar changes in the clearance of VLDL, IDL, LDL, most of the effect on LDL. And when you give them together, those increases in clearance are dramatically upgraded. There's VLDL going down 40% because clearance has gone up 70%. There's IDL going down 55% because clearance has gone up 80%. And there's LDL going down 85%, LDL pool size, because there's been almost a fourfold increase in clearance. That's why I was talking about these particles being cleared from the bloodstream is a very good thing. And there was no alteration in the amount of production of these lipoproteins. But if we unpack things a little bit further and say, okay, we're now in the PCSK9 era, what remains to be done in terms of altering lipids? LDL is fixed. Here is some information for you from the Odyssey and the Osler trials that were the accumulated phase 3 data that was put together. The change in non-HDL cholesterol is a function of the change in LDL cholesterol, which has gone down 60%, and also the change in VLDL cholesterol that's gone down only about 12 or 17%, 20%. So there is a disproportionate change in LDL cholesterol on PCSK9 inhibitors, but those remnants, those VLDL cholesterol carrying remnants, are still present in the bloodstream and therefore are still an active target for further interventions of triglyceride lowering and also other interventions like C3 lowering that might be beneficial. So I'll conclude with the following. LDL is something that we're used to. It's widely available, it's easily measured, but it is inherently inaccurate when you get it back from the lab at levels below 70 milligrams per deciliter. There is a new formula that is out there, and we should be encouraging laboratories to use it to give you a better number for LDL. Non-HDL is a superior marker of total atherogenic lipoproteins, and it's easily derived, total minus HDL. apoB, those of us who have a clinical chemistry background, think is the best marker because it's unequivocally all of the bad things in your bloodstream at once. It's easy to measure. There are no assumptions with regard to its measurement, and it represents the number of particles, atherogenic particles, that are present. And if you had a worry about an LDL that was down at 10 or 15 and you measured apoB, it would still be high enough to do all the transport and keep somebody healthy that you wanted to do. And so, as a target, it's actually got a superior biological underpinning. Thank you for your attention.